Devos, and I'm a blind writer and a disability scholar, and tonight I'll be your moderator, so great pleasure to be here. We are very pleased that so many of you have come despite the train strike, so thanks for that. And I'm going to start with two practical points. The first one is that the whole session will be recorded, and later on it's going to be broadcast on YouTube. So it's important to know that later on for the Q&A session, when you have a question or you want to share your story, that's perfectly fine. We are very pleased, but just know that it's going to be recorded. The second point is that we have a sign language interpreter for the whole evening. So thanks to Katrien for signing the lecture and the whole Q&A afterwards. Now, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our central speaker of tonight, Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, Professor Emerita of English and Bioethics at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I still vividly remember how, as a student at Leiden University some 20 years ago, I discovered and eagerly read the work of Professor Garland-Thomson. It was really a discovery for me, and since then I've been a huge fan. Because Professor Garland-Thomson was one of the absolute pioneers in the field of disability studies. Back then, a rather new domain of research that had emerged in the United States and the UK in the last decades of the 20th century. Leading disability scholars like Professor Garland-Thomson made us realize that the predominant view of disability as a natural or biological category or strictly medical issue is far too reductive. Instead, in their works, they disclosed the complex social, political, cultural, historical meanings that surround living with disability and illness. Just like former generations of scholars had undertaken a similar deconstruction of categories like gender, race, or sexual orientation. From Professor Garland-Thomson's impressive bibliography, I'd like to cite the book Extraordinary Bodies, in which she explored the representation of people with disabilities in American film and literature. In another key text, Staring, How We Look, she analyzed the social practice of staring and how we as people with visible disabilities constantly stir up the beholder's fascination in public space. More recently, she co-authored About Us, a series of essays about disability that appeared in the New York Times. Now, today, Professor Garland-Thomson will focus on another major theme which has been at the heart of her research for quite some time, namely prenatal screening and its bioethical implications for disability. It is an important but also very delicate topic which concerns us all in Western societies. According to the Flemish organization Fara, we terminate 90 to 95% of all pregnancies in which disability is identified. In Belgium, we are not allowed to deselect a child based on any other identity characteristics. Because these children are protected by equal opportunities legislation, so you cannot discriminate on basis of gender or skin color, for example. Why is this allowed with disability then? Is selective termination on the basis of disability a form of reproductive freedom for people who are pregnant, or is it a form of discrimination against people with disabilities? As Professor Garland-Thomson will argue in today's lecture, healthcare treatment, like selective testing, can benefit the common good, but harm an individual or a community. In other words, these developments confront us with an ethical dilemma between benefit and harm. In our lecture, Professor Garland-Thomson will therefore offer a framework about the ethical, social, political context and commitments of a modern liberal democracy, and how they tend to protect equality, life, self-determinacy, and how they try to protect us from harm. Now, it is my great pleasure to kindly invite Professor Garland-Thomson to take the floor.
Thank you, Piet, for that generous and kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight, and I want to thank my new colleague, Anaïs van ter Velde and Helena Verhaya. And I would also like to thank the Studium Generale, if I'm saying that properly, the organization that has sponsored this opportunity, and also the team of Voorhet for hosting us and gathering us this evening. And I would like to acknowledge and thank the interpreter. I also, of course, want to thank you for coming out, for this opportunity to learn more about disability bioethics and disability culture. And I will I need to get to the beginning here. There we go. Although I'm going to be speaking about selective termination practices, reproductive freedom, or disability discrimination, I'm actually going to get to that topic more at the end, because before we talk about that together, before we talk about the ethics and the practices that Piet mentioned in his introduction, we need to do some work together about learning about disability. So I'm going to present what I call the case for conserving disability to introduce you to some fundamental information and frameworks about disability and disability in the world. So the first point that I want to make here this evening with you is the point that disability is everywhere once you know how to look for it. And what we will be doing together tonight is looking for disability and finding it in the places that we find it. And then we'll be talking about the practices that Piet mentioned and the ethics of that in our discussion. So I want to begin with some fundamentals. The first is, what is disability? And I'm going to offer you several definitions. These are my own definitions. And I want to make what is sometimes called an access statement about my presentation. That is to say that I will be giving you this lecture, this talk tonight, and it will have three forms. First of all, it will be in my voice, so you will hear my voice. That will be one form for this lecture, for this presentation. Another form will be the visual form, that is to say the slide deck that I am presenting behind me, and I think, yes, one screen up here. And that will have two versions. I will have words on the screen, in other words, text, because some people prefer to get information through reading a text through words. Other people prefer getting information from images, pictures. So I will always try to have a picture of some sort that will convey part of what I am trying to say, so that for the purposes of access, my lecture will have three simultaneous forms. It will actually have four simultaneous forms this evening because we will also have the form of sign language. So it will be in four formats to make it as accessible as possible. I will sometimes describe the pictures that I'm using here to make them more accessible to people who may not be accessing the presentation visually, but I will do my best to present the information as capaciously as possible. So I'm going to begin with one claim or definition of disability here, and that is the human variations that we think of as disabilities are a part of the human condition, and they occur in every life and in every family. And these human variations that we think of as disabilities, that may seem like an awkward way of talking about this, are a theme in all art and all culture. It's my first statement, claim, if you will. The second claim or statement that I wish to make tonight and to offer you is the lived experiences of disability give people and communities opportunities for expression, creativity, resourcefulness, relationships, and flourishing. Disability, this is a third definition or point that I wish to make about disability. Disability is a set of stories, narratives, stories that we receive and remake. By that I mean that these are stories that we get from culture. They are brought to us as we are acculturated into the world as human beings. So disability is a set of stories that we receive and we remake. By retelling these stories in a variety of different ways, we can rewrite these received stories about disability. We can remake these stories. And these are stories, as I have suggested, about human variations that scientific medicine considers to be, and thus calls, disability, disease, illness, and I like this newer phrase, body-mind differences. So if disability is everywhere, once we know how to find it, one question, of course, is where do we find disability? And I would suggest that we find disability everywhere, but I wish to emphasize particularly with you this evening because I work in the humanities. I'm a literary scholar and a scholar of arts and of a variety of different genres of the arts. So we find disability, I want to suggest, in literature, in dance, in art, and in design. And I will give you some examples of these in our talk tonight. So I want to say also, I want to universalize disability as my definitions have suggested. Disability crosses all genre, all media, all time periods, all aesthetic themes, and all cultures. In other words, disability is everywhere, and I'm going to try to give you some examples of where we find disability and how much it reflects the human condition. So I'll start first with literature and the performing arts, because that's the area that I work in most fully, and I will begin with what is arguably the founding story of Western culture, and that is the story by Sophocles called Oedipus the King. And I'm showing you an image on the left of the cover in Greek of Oedipus the King, and on the right I'm showing you a marvelous picture, and I'll tell you a little bit about this picture. It's a black and white picture of a performer, an actor, and I don't really know very much about this actor, but the name is up here, playing the part of Oedipus in 1896. And what I want to suggest about this founding narrative of Western culture is that disability bookends the story of Oedipus. It's at the beginning. Oedipus is born with what is called a damaged foot. And that story, that foot, is what begins his journey towards self-realization and self-knowledge and the truth of his heritage. So the story begins with a disability, the damaged foot. And at the end, and this is what this photograph from 1896 is showing us, and that is that his story ends with disability. You may recall that at the end, when Oedipus discovers the truth of who he is, he decides rather symbolically and gruesomely, and of course Greek tragedy is very gruesome, to scratch out, to gash out his own eyes as a recognition that he did not see the truth, but now he knows the truth. So there is this very dramatic photograph here of disability at both the beginning and the end of this story. So we have Oedipus tearing at his clothes and blood running down his cheeks to indicate the drama of the Greek tragedy that the story of Oedipus gives us, book-ended on each end with disability. So disability is also everywhere in culture in the sense that if anyone lives long enough, they will have a disability. And so the disability that is in our body minds imprints itself on our lives, and therefore it also imprints itself on the products of our lives, what we make in our lives. So I'm going to give you some illustrations here of works of art and culture that have been imprinted by the disabilities of their authors. So first here is an image on the left of the 17th century English poet John Milton, who of course perhaps some of you know has written Paradise Lost, one of the epic poems of English literature. And of course Milton writes Paradise Lost when he is blind. Beethoven, our 19th century, arguably most important composer, composes his most important symphonies and works of music while he is deaf. Another genre of disability imprinting itself on the aesthetic products. Here's one example. This is a genre of black, blind piano performers. We have Thomas Wiggins from the late 19th century. We have Ray Charles from the 20th century, an American blind black musician. And of course, a little bit later, we have Stevie Wonder, again, an American blind black performing artist. They are all artists that are black, blind, and perform on the piano. So their embodiment, again, imprints itself on their artistic production. So this is what disability makes in this particular genre. I wanted to show this photograph because I think it's a very interesting photograph. It's taken by Matthew Brady, and it is a picture of one of the most famous men in the Western tradition, certainly in the European tradition and the American tradition in the 19th century, and that is Charles Stratton, known as General Tom Thumb, and P.T. Barnum, the famous entertainer, of course, staged many performances of people with disabilities, and this is the 1863 wedding of Charles and Lavinia Stratton, which Matthew Brady, the famous American photographer of the mid-19th century, photographed. It has been said that Charles Stratton, General Tom Thumb, might have been the most photographed person in the 19th century in America. I don't know if this is actually true, but it's a very interesting comment on the entertainment industry and people with disabilities in the entertainment industry, in this case in the 19th century. From the 20th century, I want to mention here, again, to give you an idea of where we see disability in performance. This is, again, this is an American folk opera that is called Porgy and Bess by George Gershwin, perhaps one of the most important folk operas in the American tradition. And it turns on the story of a man with a disability. And I'm showing you a picture of our actor Sidney Poitier from the 1959 film Porgy and Bess, and a more updated version of a Porgy and Bess from 2011, and we have very different versions of Porgy. A down on his knees Porgy in one version, and an upright Porgy with a really great Bess here in 2011. One of the most well-developed genres of performance is deaf culture, and I'm showing you here an image of a very short movie. It's about maybe not even 2 minutes, called Can You Read My Lips? It's about the deaf sign language user, Rachel Kolb, and I would suggest that when you get the opportunity to look at this, that you have, that you take the time to watch this video. This just gives you some general ideas. Again, in the American context, I point out that the most important, the most canonical novel of the 19th century in American literature is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Turns on the story of a disabled hero, that is Captain Ahab, who is an amputee. And in the 20th century, the most important of the 20th century American novels is called The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. And again, the protagonist, Benji Compson, of this novel is a person with a disability. So in the 19th and 20th century, disability stories are crucial to what we think of as American literature. More recently, I'm showing you an image here of some of the more recent kind of literature. This is the cover of a wonderful book called Deaf Republic. It's a book of poetry by the American poet Ilya Kaminsky, published in 2019. It's a wonderful image here of an ear made out of bricks. This is a cover of a book that Piet mentioned that I was fortunate enough to be able to edit. It's a collection of 60 or 70 short articles written about disability by people with disabilities that were published in the New York Times and collected in this 2019 book called About Us. If any of you want to read short stories written about disability, this book and all of these are available on the New York Times website, is something that's highly recommended. If you're teachers, these are particularly good essays to teach. I'll talk a bit about dance, which I think has been transformed by the presence of dancers with disabilities. This is Leroy Moore. I'm showing you a picture of Leroy Moore. He is a black man who is a poet, and he has created a dance form which he calls crip hop. He's a man with cerebral palsy, and he has also been a co-founder of the disability performance collective called Sins Invalid. And I want to concentrate a little bit on dance here because the disabled body and the disabled body mind has provided an opportunity in the arts, as I've suggested, but particularly in dance, for new, innovative movement vocabularies that are made possible by the human variations that we think of as disabilities. So this is about disability creativity and disability opportunity. Another example here from the UK is Claire Cunningham, who is a contemporary dancer. I'm showing a picture here of Claire Cunningham with a marvelous black dress and black arm crutches, as well as black opera gloves, and a wonderful commentary here on the use of what we think of as medical prosthetic and devices such as crutches that can be used as aesthetic implements or part of costuming. And so Claire Cunningham here has arm crutches, as well as one of these arm crutches on her ankle, as well as one around her neck, as if it were a kind of choker or necklace. It's a marvelous photograph. This is Jerron Herman, who is a contemporary dancer who has cerebral palsy, and his arm is configured in a very distinctive way as a result of having cerebral palsy, and he has integrated, as the photograph suggests, the distinctive shape of his arm into the movement vocabulary of contemporary dance. So if you have the opportunity to look up Jerron Herman's work, you can see many videos of this interesting new dance form. A more classic dance form that is more recognizable is illustrated here by Alice Shepard and Laurel Lawson, who are wheelchair dancers. That is to say, they are dancers who dance on wheels rather than dancing on legs. And they have, of course, developed contemporary dance virtuosity by using wheelchairs to a very sophisticated extent, and they've also incorporated ramps into their performances. Again, you can go online and you can look at some of the performances of Kinetic Light, which I would highly recommend. Another image here that I find quite interesting in relation to the opportunity that disability provides for aesthetic movement are dancers who are legless and one-legged. So it's often understood that dance needs to take place on legs. And so the opportunity for a dancer with no legs, such as David Toole, who I'm showing on the left, and Homer Avila, who was a one-legged dancer, provides an opportunity, as I suggested, for an entire new form of dance movements. David Toole uses his arms in particular, as does Homer Avila, in his dance vocabulary. The picture I'm showing here of David Toole, he is literally walking on one of his arms. His other arm is extending beautifully in an arc above his body, and he has a fan-shaped costume that covers his lower body, which is designed by the English fashion designer, late English fashion designer, Alexander McQueen. So we have a legless dancer and a one-legged dancer, redefining the vocabulary and the very concept of dance. This is one of my favorite images. This is an image taken from the Frankenstein Ballet, which was composed a few years ago and performed in London, in which we have the opportunity for the translation across aesthetic forms from the novel of Frankenstein, written by, of course, Mary Shelley, the English writer, and that form transformed, or that story transformed into a ballet, which was done by Liam Scarlett in the London Royal Opera House. Again, I don't have the date here. I think it's about 2018. And if you have the opportunity to look at this on video, it's really interesting to see how the creature in Mary Shelley's book gets translated, which is all words, gets translated into dance movements. So if you're interested in aesthetics and you're interested in the process of translation from one form to another, have a look at the Frankenstein Ballet. Okay, art and design. As I suggested to you, disability is part of the human condition and has been with us forever. We have here, for example, a multi-thousand-year-old vase, which shows scenes of a small person. That is a person with what we would call small stature, dwarfism, or in this case, I think, the medical category, achondroplasia, on this very old vase that is part of the historical record of the earliest of Western civilization. More recently, from 1656, we have Velázquez's Las Meninas, which is, again, a portrait of people of small stature, little people, people with dwarfism, in his extremely important and famous Las Meninas. More recently, from the American tradition, in 1938, Jacob Lawrence paints this marvelous modern picture of what he calls blind beggars. It's two black people going down the street, very nicely dressed, probably in New York City, probably in Harlem, with a whole parade of children around them, whooping and carrying on as they move through the streets. So again, in the entire artistic tradition, we have disability featured throughout the record if we know how to look for it. Of course, the artist Frida Kahlo, and I'm showing here two self-portraits of Frida Kahlo, who was the multiply disabled Mexican painter. This is from 1951 and 1944. These are self-portraits. One of them shows Kahlo with the tools of her trade, the palette, as well as a wheelchair. And then the more unusual, perhaps fantastic kind of picture in which she shows herself opened up with the metal spine that she had. So Frida Kahlo's got some very interesting work to look at. And of course, her characteristic eyebrows are featured in both of these paintings. I want to share with you a self-portrait which I find to be very important, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but in terms of bioethics, this is a beautiful self-portrait by the artist Riva Lehrer. Riva Lehrer is a contemporary artist who does pictures, portraits of people with disabilities, leaders often in the arts, culture, and social world, people with disabilities. Rivellera herself was born with spina bifida, and in this self-portrait, instead of presenting the front of her body, which is part of the conventional presentation of a portrait, Rivellera shows herself in a pool of water with a gold lame wrap around her, and she is displaying the characteristic back with the characteristic forms, including the scars that go along with her congenital disability, which is called spina bifida. Now, spina bifida, of course, is a characteristic that is prenatally often tested for and is often understood as a justification for termination on the basis of low quality of life. So this kind of portrait puts forward a narrative of a life lived well, a life of value that comes from a person who has lived with spina bifida. So it's a very important testimony to disability flourishing, disability culture, and disability bioethics. Of course, in this context, I wanted to present the self-portrait, of course, of the disabled artist, Vincent van Gogh. This is a self-portrait of Van Gogh with a bandaged ear, of course. So again, this is part of the genre of disabled artists doing important work. I want to point out that many of the late works, and we can certainly look at Van Gogh's portraits there as late works, but the late works of many artists are imprinted with disabilities because, as I have suggested, life brings disability to us. So this is a picture of a late work by the French artist Claude Monet, the Impressionist artist. This is water lilies. And of course, as Monet grows older and older, as would be the case for almost all of us, the older he gets, the more blind he gets. And the more blind he gets, of course, the more fuzzy his pictures get, the more they are understood as an evolution toward a finer form of Impressionism. But in fact, of course, what Monet is painting here is what Monet, in his later years, was seeing. And I'm showing here a picture as well of Monet's glasses, which were collected in an exhibit of Monet's work, which I thought was a particularly interesting testimony to disability, although I'm not sure it was understood in that way. I want to share some other more contemporary, less well-known artists with you. This is a photograph of the artist Judith Scott, born in 1943 and dies in 2005. Judith Scott was a woman born with Down syndrome and autism who never spoke, but was taken at a fairly young adult age by a family member to a workshop, a creative arts workshop that provided a bunch of materials for the people with disabilities that went to this workshop. And Judith Scott began to pull out the fiber, the yarn and the string and so forth that was collected at this workshop, and she began to wrap things. She began to tie up the string and the fiber and ended up over the lifetime, really, of her work as an artist to do many, many fiber sculptures. And she is being recognized now as one of the most important American sculpture artists. And this is a photograph, a black and white photograph of Judith Scott holding in her arms one of her wrapped sculptures, which I think is a very beautiful photograph. This is an image by a disabled painter, artist of some note in the United States. Her name is Catherine Sherwood. Catherine Sherwood was a well-established artist, a painter, and about 25 years ago she had a serious stroke which paralyzed the right side of her body, and she was right-handed, as many people apparently are. And so in order to continue her art practice, she needed to start painting and drawing with her left hand, which apparently, I don't understand handedness myself. I have unusual hands. I don't understand handedness very well, but apparently it's very difficult to paint or to do artwork with your non-dominant hand. But this was an opportunity for Catherine Sherwood to redefine her art practice, and she began to incorporate disability into her artwork. This is a picture called Olympia, which of course is a reference to the Manet very famous odalisque, the painting Olympia. And what Catherine Sherwood has done here is that she's put a leg brace on her Olympia to give this Olympia a disability, as she often does. But more important, she has substituted the face of many of her artworks, including this Olympia, with an image of the X-ray of her own brain, which she uses in all of her artwork. So this very unusually infaced Olympia is part of Catherine Sherwood's art practice. Go to her website if you have time. The work is very interesting. This is another more recent picture. It's not very large, but I wanted to show it to you a little bit because she is, again, continuing her art practice of adopting or adapting both traditional artworks and art forms by adding her own distinctive disabled faces, that is to say, the faces of her X-rays, the images of her brain. And this is a Madonna, very typical Madonna with the face of Catherine Sherwood's images, X-ray images, and the Christ child also has a face made out of these images of Catherine Sherwood's brain. I'll talk a little bit about accessible or inclusive design here as something that disability makes in the world. Here is a photograph of some of the newer prosthetics. This is from the Alternative Limb Project. It's a picture of a full leg prosthetic, which is a beautiful blue, and it is designed with flowers and vines. And this prosthetic leg, of course, is a leg designed to be seen rather than to be hidden. So this is part of disability pride. Prosthetics used to be designed to be hidden, and now prosthetics tend to be designed to be seen. They're fashion statements, expressive, as I suggested, of a new kind of post-disability rights pride. This is Hugh Hare, who is a very important engineer at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the United States. He is a double amputee who is designing with his lab a whole series of high-tech prosthetic legs, and this shows him in a mid-century modern chair with his mid-century, late 20th century, early 21st century prosthetic legs. He's a mountain climber, of course. This is Kathy D. Woods. She is a person of small stature, a person with achondroplasia. She's a black an African-American woman, and she has a very successful design line of clothes that she wanted to design adult professional clothes for small people. She was tired of wearing kids' clothes, and so she has come up with this company where she's designing clothes for people with disabilities. This is a tactile watch, which is a beautiful design. It is a watch that is designed more to be touched than to be seen, so that one can tell the time here by rubbing one's fingers around the marks, around the edge of the watch, but the hand of the watch is a little ball that moves around the center of the watch. It's a very beautiful and elegantly designed watch. The last image I want to show you of design in the world and that transformation of the world to become more accessible, actually the second to the last slide, is a ramp. And this ramp can be found in Berkeley, California. It is an enormous spiral or helical shaped ramp, and it is at the very center of a very important building in Berkeley, California. And it's bright red, and it's big, and it conveys a message. And the message is that the disability and human rights movement was devoted to the prospect of desegregating, that is to say, making the world available to and accessible to people with disabilities. And the way that it needed to happen is that the built and designed environment itself needed to be transformed. The doors could not simply be opened, the ramps had to be built. And at the beginning of this process, everywhere, buildings were being changed by being ramped. And very often what happened 30 or 40 years ago is that a building thought to be an important building would have an ugly ramp put up in front of it. And that was thought to ruin the aesthetic value of the building. It was fastened on rather than built in. But over the last 30, 40, even 50 years, architects and designers have come to make the ramp itself the center design feature of many beautiful new buildings. And this ramp at the very center of this important building in California, I think, illustrates the centrality of access and inclusion and desegregation to the built environment. The international symbol of access, which is used extensively in the United States, and I think perhaps here as well, has been transformed as well. I'm showing on the left in 1968, the original international symbol of access. It's the blue stick figure with the suggestive wheelchair, the icon of accessibility, and it's a rather static stick figure, but redesigned in 2010. We have a lot of this in the US. I don't know whether you see it here. There is a new symbol that is a much more dynamic symbol. This symbol of the stick figure leaning forward in the wheelchair suggests the empowerment of self-propelling that is often characteristic now of wheelchairs and other devices, which have liberated people with disabilities in a newly accessible environment out and about in the public world. I wanted to include this in particular because this is an image of a community that has been built in your neighborhood. This is a dementia village. It is a village built not by enclosing people with dementia and locking them up, but rather creating an environment which will be felicitous to people with dementia so that their needs will be met and that they will be able to live successfully in the community. And I'm going to struggle with this a bit, but this is De Hogewijk. How did I do? In Weeps in the Netherlands. So this is a place you can visit and yourself live there. I want to finish with this tour through arts and culture by suggesting what my images have suggested, and that is that finding disability is an opportunity to explore, to redefine, and to make new stories about what it means to be human. Disability is at the core of what it means to be human. And finding disability will give us an opportunity to better understand what it means to be human. And I want to end with what I have called the case for conserving disability. So in suggesting what Piet mentioned, and that is that I want us to be able to talk about some medical practices such as selective testing and selective termination on the basis of finding disability in the medical scientific environment. I want to suggest that an antidote to that idea of eliminating disability through testing and termination, and other medical practices designed to eliminate people with disabilities from the human condition. This would include some of the euthanasia practices, so we can speak about that as well. That I've made what I call the case for conserving disability, and I want to use conservation here intentionally to draw from environmentalism, from the conservation movement, and to suggest that while we are interested in the world in conserving endangered plants and animal species, we are much less concerned with conserving endangered human species. And I want to suggest that we might be able to take a conservation approach to disability ethics, and therefore I'm making, as I said, what I call a case for conserving disability. And so I'm offering a couple of comments or definitions, if you will, here. And that is, a conservationist ethics focuses on, and these are hard definitions, that's why I've written them here. This conservationist ethics focuses on creating a supportive, material context, what I want to call a moral ecosystem, in which human lived embodied existence can successfully thrive as it is. In other words, without being cured, without being fixed, so that we can live as we are in a sustaining environment, an environment that sustains us. And I want to suggest further that a conservationist ethics aims to strengthen the cultural, political, and institutional climate, I like this word to think of climate change here, in which people with disabilities can most effectively flourish, that is to say, live well. So I want us to have a better understanding of what disability can make, how disability comes to us all, and how we can flourish with disabilities so that people with disabilities can be supported by our societies and our families and our communities as we are. And then I'm going to end with a little bit of a very brief history of disability, what I call disability bioethics. And I'll begin with the beginning of disability bioethics because I want us to understand the history of this a little bit. This is a slide which says human rights as disability justice. And I'm showing an image here of Eleanor Roosevelt in 1948. She was the wife of President Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States at that time. And she was very involved in founding the United Nations. And this is, she's holding an image here, or she's holding the thing, a declaration, a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed and initiated in 1948. And of course, this is the first human rights declaration that says, primarily, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And this is the principle of liberal democratic orders, and it is the principle from which disability rights, disability justice, as well as a variety of other justice and rights movements have been drawn. For example, I hope I have an image. No, I don't. For example, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, as well as things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, and many of the laws that we have that bring rights to people with disabilities and that desegregate the built and public environment come from these human and civil rights movements and the logic of radical equality and freedom that is built into these various covenants, and there are many of them. But I wanted to put the framework here around disability bioethics as being this framework of human and civil rights, which bring dignity and rights for all. And now I'll talk just a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing. I want to suggest here that there are communities of people with disabilities that are particularly threatened through prenatal testing and diagnosis, and the practices of termination on the basis of these that are so widely practiced, as Piet suggested. This is the cover. It's a very good article. I would suggest using this, taking a look at it. It's from Atlantic Magazine. It's a very long article in 2020 called "The Last Children of Down Syndrome." And it's a report on the endangered community, in this case in Denmark, of people with disabilities, because the termination rate is very high in these Nordic countries. And this article was inspired by the announcement by Iceland, as well as some other of the Nordic countries in 2020, that they had eliminated the disease of Down syndrome. And so this is a particularly helpful article to put in context the fact that people with Down syndrome and these kinds of highly tested for disabilities are endangered species, and that there are many people in the world that represent these communities and care about these communities. So it's a very good article, which I would suggest looking at. And I will end by sharing with you a few of the images that I myself am working on. I'm interested in public culture, didactic public culture art, public art. And I wanted to start with one of the most important didactic or teaching images in public art, and that is the Pietà, which is done, of course, by Michelangelo. And I'm showing here the most common representative of this story of embodiment that is fundamental to the Western tradition, in this case the Christian tradition, and that is this image of holding that is part of what I call a choreography of body care. And here we have the familiar public image of Mary, the mother of Jesus, holding the dead, in this case, son on her lap, in a very tender pose of lament. This is the reading that is often given to the Pietà in general, certainly to Michelangelo's very famous Pietà. This image is almost a meme. It is so common. But I think that these common images can be redone and can be put out there and reinterpreted to give us a bioethics of disability and a bioethics of care and a bioethics that respects the body and the wounds of the body with the cultural authority that comes from these Christian and Western traditions, really. And what I have discovered is that there are many, many versions of the Pietà that are recognizable as Pietàs because of this bodily choreography of one person holding, in a particular configuration, another person. And I want these to be read as care images and as affirmations of human vulnerability and human disability. So I'll share with you a few of the many, many Pietà images which exist in the world of public art that I think affirm what I call an ethics of care. This is one done in 2007 by the Australian artist Sam Jinks. It's called Still Life or Pietà, in which Jinks uses realism, as did Michelangelo in his Pietà, but he changes the figures in ways that re-narrate or retell a particular story of human embodiment. So what we have here, instead of the mother of God, Mary, or the mother of Jesus, if you will, holding the figure, we have an ordinary man gazing down in a expression of contemplation, perhaps lament, it's hard to know, gazing down not at a young person, or certainly a son, as we imagine Michelangelo's sculpture to do, but rather gazing down on the body of a very, very old person. So perhaps this is the son holding the parent, rather than the parent holding the son. And this rewrites a story, I want to suggest. And it's a story of contemplation of human embodiment, which is, of course, what we have in Michelangelo's Christian Pietà. But here we have a different kind of story with an ordinary person looking at mortality and aging and disability in the face and holding, in a very tender, tender posture of love and care, that body. So this can be interpreted as every man gazing at his own future, or every man gazing at his ancestors and thinking about his descendants. It's a very evocative, I think, work of sculpture, which takes its meaning from its reference to the very well-known sculpture that Michelangelo does. And there's a whole genre of these. Here's another representation. This is from 2018 by the American artist Tylon Sawyer. It's called Pietà. We have a very different choreography here, although a recognizable choreography of a person holding in this embrace on one's lap another person. In the background here, we have some very didactic imagery, that is to say, an American flag. And the person, the mother figure here, seems clearly to be a female figure. Instead of looking down in a gaze of lament, this figure of the black woman is looking straight out in a gaze of accusation at the viewer and holding on her lap, in this same choreography, this same pose, a young black boy in the characteristic costume of black victims of violence in the United States, and that is a hoodie. So what we have here is an illusion. We have a rewriting of a artwork which serves a didactic, that is a teaching purpose. And I want to suggest that the human variations we think of as disability and mortality and vulnerability and human care are at the root of all of these works of art. And I want to suggest that this is some of the work that what we think of as disability can do in the world. Thank you. And I'll end with this image that we will have up here, and now we can have a conversation which puts practices such as selective testing and selective termination into conversation, and think about them in the larger context of the history of disability in human communities and in the human life course. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you very much for this crystal clear and wonderful presentation, very rich in imagery, references to all kinds of arts, so showing us the universality of disability throughout our history, and yeah, let's say in it's present in all cultures. So I think it's a very strong plea and case for the opportunities that disability can offer us in not only the arts, but maybe we would say the art of living. All the same, I am wondering, because you've shown us so many good examples of this recurrent theme of disability throughout times and cultures, I'm still wondering why we still overlook it. So I will illustrate what I mean by saying, for example, here in Belgium and Western Europe in general, we see that there is more attention for diversity and diversification in cultural institutions, in museums, for example, or in literary or artistic prizes, whatsoever. There is a growing interest in diversity. And when people talk about diversity, they refer to gender, to ethnicity, to let's say sexual orientation, all post-colonial decolonization of the museum, etc. All very important movements which we all have to celebrate and support, obviously. But where is disability in this story? It really strikes me very often that in this list, disability is absent. We are still waiting for, let's say, the big overviews of the kind of, let's say, the kind of exhibition you could make of your presentation. Overviews of disabilities in artists' lives, in references in art to disabilities. Why do you think do we still overlook it so often, this very important theme of disability?
That's a very important question. Thank you, Piet, for asking it. I think that the logic that I mentioned, the human and civil rights movement's logic of equality, which is what has given us the value and the requirement, really, and the understanding that a diverse community, an inclusive community is a more moral community, but also a politically and socially appropriate kind of community. And it, I think, is easier for us to recognize more stable what we think of as diversity categories, such as race or gender. Sexual orientation, I'd like to talk a little bit about rather separately, because I think that's also a category that's a little bit more confusing for most people. Most of us have a general idea about what gender or sex might be. We know how to recognize the various categories more or less. The same thing with ethnicity and race. They are more legible, if you will, categories of diversity, of difference. Disability is a hard category to recognize, and that is because it is so diverse in its form, and also because we move in and out of disability over a lifetime. So it's fairly clear to us that we can recognize disability in its more canonical forms. That is to say, when someone is marked by, say, using a wheelchair or a white cane or the various forms of disability that are to us recognizable, but there are so many other forms that we are not familiar with. And also, I think identifying as disabled can also in many places be something that people are not necessarily willing to do. There's still a great deal of disability bias, a great deal of disability prejudice. There are not very many incentives to identify as disabled unless one has to. And so we move in and out of disability. Disability has so many different, often unrecognizable forms that it's hard for most of us to know what disability is or to know how to react to it. So I think it's a harder concept for us than some of our other diversity categories, such as race, gender, and ethnicity. Not that those are clear, I don't want to suggest that, but I think we have a somewhat of a better idea in social circumstances of those categories.
Would you also say that there is some kind of fear for disability being involved? I am thinking of the analysis, famous analysis by another founder of disability studies, Piet Devos, about the fragmented bodies of Greek culture. Where art historians would discuss all these fragmented sculptures as being complete, and he related that to the fear of disability and its relation to or its prejudice prejudice relation to suffering, for example, and death.
Well, I think, of course, as I suggested, disability is a porous category. The boundaries on it are not very clear, and as I've suggested, disability comes to all of us. So our other identity categories are generally more stable, but we will all come to disability. So I think it becomes a category that is less when it's less clear, and when we move in and out of it, it can be in its instability. I don't want to use the word fear particularly. I think what people really should fear is bias and discrimination against people with disabilities, which is pervasive, and that might be what people should be fearing, but I think oftentimes a non-disabled person will be apprehensive or fearful of becoming disabled because it's often associated with woundedness and with loss and with injury in a way that these other identity categories aren't. We are fairly stable in those other, as I've suggested, identity categories. So I think fear certainly is involved, but I am reluctant to do a psychoanalytic, as some people do, analysis saying that disability is somehow a profound Freudian category of threat. I think the fear is and should be discrimination against us when we inevitably move into disability. I think the move toward a more accessible world is really an important one, since eventually everyone will have some kind of mobility impairment. Eventually everyone will be late life deafened. Eventually everyone will be late life blinded. And so the more we recognize as we go through life that the world is being rebuilt, at least the world that has resources, is being rebuilt to accommodate these differences. that there are ways of being out in the world now that there weren't 50 or 60 years ago. I think that's a very positive thing for us to observe, so that we don't have to feel that when we become disabled or when we become old, and those are synonymous, that we have to retreat from life.
Yeah, well, to link this argument to discussion concerning prenatal screening, several years ago I conducted also quite some research on prenatal screening here in Belgium and the Netherlands, because since 2017, just like in Scandinavia, we offer prenatal screening almost for free. The non-invasive prenatal screening, I have to say, the NIPT test, to all pregnant women, and so to some extent, of course, it is very democratic to offer it almost for free to everyone. But this will, and it does, imply, just as it was shown in the article about Denmark you showed us, that the number of children being born with Down syndrome, for instance, is decreasing year after year, and will probably be zero in some time. Now, when I was doing my research, I came across an article by a gynecologist. The gynecologist, a strong advocate for prenatal screening, and his argument was, it is our moral duty to avoid bringing more suffering in the world. And this, in his opinion, his view, implied, okay, also avoiding so babies being born with Down syndrome. So it was a moral duty, according to him, to do this prenatal testing. How would you answer such an, still very predominant argument, I would say?
I think the best argument is to reveal the bias, the prejudice that is built into medical science, and that is the assumption that all human variation that is understood as a minority forms of embodiment are labeled as pathology. So that's one. The other is the prevalence, the moral and medical predominance of the concept of normal. And these two things, of course, are tied up together. Normal is a particular template of being that is raised above all other forms as that which is what we want to achieve, as well as the threshold of value for human beings. And I think this needs to be questioned over and over again. And I think the best way to question it is to bring in evidence that lives lived with a disability can be very good lives, and that to be born supposedly non-disabled is no guarantee at all of a better life, and that there are many other factors besides disability status that determine quality of life. Disability does not determine quality of life, and we can see that with looking at all sorts of outcomes of lived lives. So that's bringing that information in, I think, is really important. I think we need to offset the overdetermined and naive and false assumption that to live with a disability is to suffer, and to live a non-disabled life is to not suffer. We need to have a much clearer understanding of what suffering is. We need to be able to more clearly disentangle suffering from pain and talk about those distinctions. We need to be able to figure out the difference between treatment for disability and eliminating people on the basis of disability. Those two aims need to be disentangled as well. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in medical education and in education in general, but certainly in medical education, to try to question these assumptions that quality of life is linked to ability or disability status, because plenty of evidence exists to suggest that that's simply not the case. And in terms of prenatal diagnosis on the basis of risk for disability, we need to bring forward more the truth, frankly, that prediction is not a very valid way of imagining a life, that Down syndrome is a great example of this. We need to also what's called historicize something like Down syndrome. So this is a good test case, because the test for Down syndrome was the first genetic test developed in what I call the reproductive environment. It begins to be tested for in the 1960s because it's easy to be tested for. And in the 1960s, of course, people born with Down syndrome didn't have a very high quality of life for two reasons. One is that they were almost universally institutionalized, and no one does well in an institution. So doing badly, having a bad life, was a self-fulfilling prophecy in that case very often. That was number one. And number two, the treatments for Down syndrome, for some of the medical accompaniments of Down syndrome. Some people born with Down syndrome have other heart effects. And so there was no development of treatment for these conditions in the 1960s. So it made some sense to judge that people born with Down syndrome would have a low quality of life. But now, decades later, we are still practicing that test. That's still the number one genetic test in the reproductive environment. And people, as Piet has suggested, with Down syndrome are being terminated at extraordinarily high rates, even though quality of life and good health for people with Down syndrome born into environments that are supportive, family environments and economic and healthcare environments, is extremely high. And yet, we still stay with this practice and its set of prejudices against people with Down syndrome. So this illustrates something in human communities of when something gets started, it's hard to stop, even after the logic of what it was put in place for has been long dismissed. And I think that's very much the case with Down syndrome.
Yeah, I think to some extent, I don't know whether you would agree on this, but the strong emphasis on prenatal screening and or for example genetic carrier tests as well, is very much linked to DNA being seen as a new ground for objective truth. What I was struck by when I conducted these interviews some years ago with healthcare workers was, okay, this idea of we do genetic tests, and on the basis of this objective information, what the DNA reveals, then parents can decide whether or not they want to continue the pregnancy or not. But what I missed in these narratives was mainly the fact that the whole choice of testing, what you're testing on, is so much entangled with moral values and political decision making, social political decision making. So, isn't that also one of these stories we need to rewrite and rethink about DNA and the genes being a ground for objective truth?
Absolutely. There are several factors. The first is, of course, more of a psychosocial as well as a political circumstance, and that is that free choice or free will is a hypothetical circumstance. No choice is ever made in a completely free and unbiased environment. There is always some context surrounding any kind of choice, whether it's scientific medical choice, whether it's any kind of human choice, that and that context of that in which that choice is made needs to be examined. So if you're making a choice in, say, the prenatal environment, it's important to understand that these are not simply neutral choices, that these narratives of abnormality and these narratives of disease and burden and suffering that are prejudicial narratives about people with disabilities are widely circulating and are not questioned very often at all. So there are all sorts of things that can be done in clinics and in medical education to work against these biases. And so that's part of what bioethics can do, is to think about making interventions in medical education, but also questioning the idea of consent as totally free, I think is a really important kind of thing. So when we make choices in the reproductive environment or the obstetrical clinics, we are not choosing freely and without any kinds of prejudice. So there's a great deal of discrimination against people with disabilities that is out there in the world already. And so medical education and medical practice needs to work against this in some way. And there's a lot that's being done in that respect. But of course, the other part that you're mentioning is that since the era of genetic knowledge, if you will, after the Human Genome Project gave us the information about our genetic selves, what has evolved, of course, is some very reductive narratives and some assumptions that might be called genetic essentialism. What we, of course, when we know a lot about genes, we can know a lot about genes, but that doesn't mean that we know very much about how a gene will be expressed, for one thing, but also how that genetic expression will structure an actual life. So I think we need to have as I suggested, whole new set of stories, because there is so much bias against disability and living with disability that's embedded in this society and certainly embedded in the premises of medicine.
Yes, and so I think it's extremely important to oppose or review or revise these medical education and predominant views among healthcare workers. But as you just said, choices are never totally free and unbiased, although neoliberals want us to believe that. And what I think we should also consider in this context is the choices that expectant parents have to make. Because many told me that they also felt a very strong social pressure not only from doctors, but also from relatives and friends and so on, to do the prenatal testing. You must be quite strong-headed to resist these narratives and to say, no, I don't want these tests, or I want to do the tests, but even so, when it predicts I will have a child with disability, I will carry the child, so I will not terminate. How do you think about this? How can we help parents to, have a more nuanced opinion about disability and to make a more balanced choice in this?
Well, access to information, of course, is really crucial in any kind of medical treatment regime. So the difficulty is that in the obstetric environment, an obstetric patient needs to be given as much information as possible, and testing is one form of information. And so it becomes, as you suggested, very difficult for an obstetric patient to say no to the testing, and it becomes an obligation for medical practitioners and genetic counselors to offer repeatedly the tests. So this can sometimes feel like pressure in the sense that many times, every time a pregnant person or a woman goes to the obstetrician, they're asked over and over again, do you want the test? Do you want the test? Do you want the test? You've refused the test. Are you sure you don't want the test? And it begins to feel like pressure often to these folks. And then, of course, once the test results come back, there are questions again in order for the patients to be able to exercise consent and have some sort of control over their medical treatment. They have to keep saying no if they don't want these treatments. And so in part, it's the apparatus of medical practice and consent in general, but it can also function basically as a prejudicial environment against people with disabilities. Now, one way that this is being handled, at least in the U.S. context, is through providing information. So part of the information that an obstetric patient might get is, here is a diagnostic test that indicates a certain risk for a certain kind of condition. And then the next piece of information would be, what does that mean, and what else do you might need to know about this? And so there's a lot of work being done about providing positive information other than just the option of termination to obstetric patients in this respect. But generally speaking, that's harder to do, and that's not always available. So providing information is one solution, at least, to the problem of prejudicial narratives in medical clinics toward disability.
Yes, thank you so much. I still a lot of questions, but I would like to open the floor because I'm sure that there are also questions among the audience. After all this thought-provoking arguments and maybe counterintuitive or well, let's say for maybe quite some people new views on disability. So
I want to just say one thing, though. I
Yes.
didn't do this. All of the things I've been saying for all these minutes together can be summed up by what my late colleague Adrian Ash, the bioethicist who was blind, would say when she talked to audiences of medical practitioners, and she simply said, quality of life doesn't correlate with disability.
Yeah, I think that's a very good one-liner to summarize all this. Are there any questions? Please feel free.
We're going to use the microphone, so we'll have what I call pretentiously, a robust auditory environment for all.
Yeah.
You mentioned the rate of termination of pregnancies of people with the Down syndrome in Scandinavian countries. Was there ever a reflection about Scandinavian countries have a history of sterilizing indigenous groups of people? Was there ever a reflection on the intersectionality of ethnicity and disability in those countries?
I'm not sure about termination rates. I don't know the numbers on this very well. What I do know is that if we assume that the bias against raising a child with a disability is based on the idea that children with disabilities are a financial and economic burden, which is often what is used to justify why termination on the basis of disability is a rational idea. I think that's countered by the fact that these Nordic countries, and I don't know about the numbers here, but these Nordic countries that have these very high quality, they're social welfare states. So they have very high standards of living for all people. There's having a disability, living with a disability, having a disabled child doesn't need to be a financial burden at all, and they still have an extraordinarily high termination rate. So there's something at play in the world about attitudes toward people with disabilities that I think we need to pay attention to. Does that address your question somewhat?
I was also asking about these countries. I have family from Denmark, from Sweden. Mm-hmm. They have a history of sterilizing indigenous groups of people, like Sami and Inuits. Mm-hmm. I was thinking if there was like a correlation or some sort of common mentality in both the history of towards disabled people and indigenous people.
Yes, I can't speak to that, of course, within the Nordic, the logic of the Nordic countries, but of course in the U.S. And other countries that I know something about, such as Australia, people with from indigenous populations are also, of course, under great threat. In some ways for similar reasons, in the sense that they are often people that don't fit into the, at least attitudinal, if not the designed and built environment. Mm-hmm. So that might be a similar correlation. And of course, when I use the idea of disability conservation, the idea of conserving people with disabilities as a kind of endangered tribe, if you will, I do that quite intentionally to make those same kinds of comparisons.
Yes.
We have a question in the back here as well But I also wanted to say something about the last question, because I know that Sweden also has a very long history of sterilizing people with disabilities. I think Sweden, up until 1975, still sterilized people with disabilities, as well as ethnic groups like the Sami. So there's definitely an overlap between the two happening there, I think. And now I give the mic to you.
Yes, one thing to take a look at in regard to what we're talking about just now, of course, is what we call the history of eugenics. Eugenics, very briefly here, was science in the late 19th century, and certainly up through the first 3 decades of the 20th century until just about 1946. And eugenics, of course, as many of you know, is the science, not pseudoscience, but the science of improving humanity. And it's a very important history for us to look at, because it was one of those things that in retrospect we can see looked like a really good idea at the time, as many things that we are doing now seem like a really good idea, which ended up, of course, when it was played out fully, into its logical conclusion, ended up being one of the most immoral and terrible results of any human idea or thinking. And I think looking at eugenics as something that was a very positive thing, seemed to be to human beings a very positive thing at the beginning, and ended up being, as I said, perhaps arguably the worst thing that human beings have ever done to one another. We might want to study that a little bit more carefully, and to be aware of what is sometimes called the new eugenics. That is to say, this idea of eliminating people from the world on the basis of what we imagine as their genetic, positive genetic profiles, and also elevating people who are understood as having positive eugenic properties. Positive genetic properties or futures.
Yeah. Hello. I know 2 moms who each have children with a disability. These children cannot eat and talk and walk and, well, basically live for themselves. And my question was, like, if they knew this beforehand, that they couldn't do anything on their own, what would the moral duty be of these moms? Because, like, most of the time the doctors said that they would only live for, like, well, at least 8 months or something. But one of the children, well, actually adults, that I now know is 30 years old, but still cannot live for themselves. So, like, it's, yeah, I don't know. Maybe you can fill in the rest.
Yes, I think there are 2 aspects of your question that we need to think about morally or ethically, and that is that modern medicine, modern Western medicine, is filled with a great faith in the capacity. Modernity is this as well. A great faith in the capacity to predict, and a great investment in predicting, a great investment in taking action in the present that will control future outcomes. So earlier societies tended to think more, and other non-Western societies, if you will, tend to think more in terms of divine control over the outcomes of the future, but modern societies tend to invest citizens or people with the freedom, if you will, to take an action in the present that will control an outcome in the future. And that's quite a burden because, of course, it relies on creating narratives, as I've suggested, about the future that are in the form of prediction. And medicine is perhaps one of the strongest ideologies in this respect, with its diagnostic categories and its prescriptions and its prognosis. And what we find is that and these are all statistical calculations. And so statistical calculations might have some virtue on a population level. This is what public health is about. But on the individual level, we find very often that there's an enormous difference between what the medical scientific narratives of the future might be and how those actually play out in human lives. And this is really an enormous burden for us as subjects of these liberal orders now. And I think you're giving us an example of this when you have the expectation of a person coming into your life, when you're going to have a new member of a family, you're inundated with information that is very difficult to know how it's going to turn out. So we're filled with all sorts of statistical predictions about how long someone's going to live or what their life is going to be like. And in reality, lives are often very different from that. But those are not the dominant stories.
Another question?
More questions?
Sorry. Like now, like the mom who is waiting. Well, they said the woman would die in like 8 months. Now she's 30 years old. So I don't know what that woman is feeling, but I know that the mom is, well, waiting every day for something to happen. And you don't know, you only know one perspective of the story. But is it fair? And well, still, what is like the moral or the morality in this part or on both parts?
I'm not sure what you're asking. I think that the medical workers, practitioners have an obligation, of course, as they do, to bring forward information. Genetic counselors, for example, or doctors of all kinds, that are predictive information. And of course, predictive information, as I suggested, it's statistical calculations. And so when you say, for example, this is the story that we, never want to hear, you have 6 months to live, that's based on a compilation of thousands, I don't know, of other people. And in reality, what actually happens is what matters to human life. And so making decisions based on that is very difficult for us as human beings. But that's part of how knowledge and medicine operate in the world. So it seems to me that one of the most useful things that we can do as human beings is to look for other forms of knowledge or evidence, if you will. If we have a medical diagnosis of some kind that has its predictive narrative in it, of any kind, whether it's you have 6 months to live, or this baby will never walk or have a good life, or whatever we hear in terms of these predictive narratives. I think it's important for us to go and find other stories in other places. Talk to people who have had this experience, talk to families, read books. There's lots of information out there in narrative form that isn't informed by these statistical calculations that are such an important part of medical knowledge, medical and scientific knowledge. There's a wonderful book. The title is probably better than the book. It's written by a woman named Harriet McBride Johnson, and it's called Too Late to Die Young. And her argument, or her point, is that she was born with some, what we'd think of as serious musculoskeletal disorder. I don't know what. She had some diagnostic category. And her parents were told that she wouldn't live longer than 1 year or 2 years. And in fact, she used a wheelchair. She kept being told that she was she was going to die young. She was going to die at 2, she was going to die at 3, she was going to die at 4. And she said after a while, she just began to understand that she wasn't going to die young. And it was very freeing for her, because she felt like every year she got was a gift, and she could do whatever it was that she wanted to do with her life. In fact, she lived well into her 50s. She was a power wheelchair user and had a pretty, what we would think of as a significant physical disability of some kind. I don't know what, but she went to school eventually, and she became a lawyer and had a very full life that she understood as a gift that gave her a truly open future. And it's ironic, I've written about this, that what we imagine as an open future is one where there is no medical diagnosis imagined to close it down. But for her, it was that medical diagnosis that actually gave her such an open future. I think it's an interesting concept. And a great title.
Could I ask a question too? Thank you so much to both of you also for the conversation and the extremely interesting questions during the conversation between the two of you. What you say about the importance of information, I think is absolutely crucial. And I think in this country here in Belgium, that question arises not only in the context of prenatal screening and the beginning of life or the preventing of life from coming into the world, but also when you say as we get old, we may get disabilities, etc. That too is, of course, something that you can prevent in Belgium because of the increasing prevalence of euthanasia, and also all kinds of debates on who is eligible for euthanasia and so on. And I think in both cases, it depends on, what are the images we have. For example, why are so many people writing advanced directives with regard to dementia? Because they think, a life with dementia cannot possibly be worth living, because we have all kinds of images about it, etc. And then we see this photo of, what was it, in Weesp in the Netherlands, and it's like, that too might be an image of the kinds of lives that people with dementia might have. But okay, who gives that information to people? And when we've conducted lots of interviews, both on abortion but also on euthanasia, and it's always this thing about, but I don't want to be a burden. I'm going to be a burden unless I say, okay, I will exercise my right to self-determination and ask for this lethal injection, and also the glorification of self-determination, autonomy, etc. in bioethics, then you can avoid being a burden, but this desperate need, well, first of all, to think of it as a burden, but this thing that you hear all the time about avoiding being a burden, not wanting to be dependent on anyone else, not wanting to rely on care by other human beings, is such a prevalent theme when you interview both patients and physicians in relation to medical ending of life, but also in the context of selective termination. We've just finished a large-scale interview study with gynecologists about second and third trimester termination, and something that particularly struck me, a couple of years ago we started having this series on TV called Down the Road, which is about people with Down syndrome. I think it's the first time in Belgium that there was any program like that on TV. For me, it was a complete eye-opener. It made me aware of an awful lot of biases and so on. And all of these gynecologists, when you ask them, okay, what kind of information do you give to people? Because they all say, oh, but a lot of conditions are a spectrum, and we tell people it's a spectrum and there is no homogeneous image, etc. But at the same time, they all said, but of course we tell people what the worst case scenario is, because that's our obligation. As doctors, we have to paint the worst possible scenario so that they can't say that they were not informed. But if you then ask, well, do they also get any other information? Then you would say, well, I hope they're not watching Down the Road, because otherwise they might get this rosy image and they might decide not to terminate a Down pregnancy. So it's not only about what information do they get from the medical practitioners, but also suppose they would say, oh, but I've seen this program and I think possibly a life with Down might be worth living, then that information might already be crushed. If a doctor then says, oh, no, but that's totally not representative, only the best, only the highest functioning people are shown there. And this is just one example, but throughout those interviews you heard that all the time. Or the legal obligation we have in our abortion law that the person discussing it has to mention something about the possibility of adoption. Adoption is never mentioned when there is a disability, because the assumption is no one would ever want a child with a disability anyway. So even though the law says you have to mention adoption, it is just never done. There too, it's really, really puzzling when you think about it. So I think the medical profession is still an extremely important gatekeeper for that information. And in the broader society, those images, those alternative narratives, etc., I think we don't see many of them in Belgium. And the question is, what can we do to make sure that it's not simply up to the medical profession to convey all these stories and to say, well, you can always exercise your right to self-determination and you can always end this suffering if you want to, or if you don't want to be a burden, we have this option for you.
Well, you've outlined the situation in Belgium, and my experience is that this is the situation everywhere, is that the Western medicine's framing of human diversity contains in it extreme bias against disability and other what we think of as categories as well. Many of us know about the institutionalization of sexism and even misogyny in every institution. And this is the result, basically, of the long, deep history of patriarchy and what is sometimes called possessive individualism or masculinism. There are a lot of ways to narrate these limitations in modern liberal societies. And they are not characteristics specifically of our moment. They come from a long, deep heritage of what I'm calling all those things: patriarchy, masculinism, misogyny, racism, you name it, however we want to characterize it. But on the other hand, liberalism in the broadest sense, and what I'm characterizing as the human and civil rights movement of the 20th century, has given us some tools. So while there are certainly limits to the idea of consent, Politically, a liberal democracy is based on the concept of consent of the governed, just as medical practice is basically informed by the idea of informed consent. And so I think rather than, I think it's important to be able to have a clear picture of what the ethical and political possibilities are, and then work as we do constantly to, at the local level, whether it's in the clinic or in our families or in the workplace or in the government, to work to bring those promises to their most ethical fulfillment. Sounds a little pie in the sky, but I think it's important not to be cynical about what, and I'm not saying you are, but to not be cynical about what the possibilities are. As I said, in countries that are relatively economically well off, even though we have this terrible situation we've described specifically about people with Down syndrome, it's still the best time in all of human history in a relatively economically secure community to have a disability.
I think this is a good and positive note. Yeah, and do we still well? Yeah? Okay. One more?
And, it's
very
a really short one, so don't worry.
good.
My question is, how do we dance the very sloppy slope in between advocating for disability rights and not falling into the trap of pro-life narratives? Very short and simple
short question.
Enjoy.
But a far-reaching one, yeah.
The thing about bioethics or medical ethics in general that I think is really the most interesting and the most challenging is that it's the question of carrying out morality or right and wrong or ethics in the applied context of practice. And so what you have often is not the conflict between a right and a wrong, but the conflict in practice between two things that are right. So to think about reproductive liberty as an example here, and I'm really glad you asked this because I think this is precisely the issue, and that is, on the one hand, liberty interests and modern social orders based on consent of the governed or the principle of self-determination would suggest that everyone has the right and the obligation to make the family that they want. So that's one good. In carrying it out, however, there can be many ethical and moral violations in making the family that a person wants. One of them could be saying, I don't want a person with a disability in my family, and therefore I am going to eliminate this, and this is very tricky, but I'm going to eliminate this potential person, or what the right often calls preborn children, because I don't want that person to be in my family. That should be, to a certain extent, someone's right. But on the other hand, it is also threatening the life of someone who is being basically eliminated from the human community on the basis of characteristics that we consider characteristics worthy of preserving. That is to say, people shouldn't be discriminated against based on disability. So you have these moral principles in tension with one another, and carrying out in practice and policy how that is to be adjudicated is extremely complicated, as we see almost everywhere. And so questions like abortion, testing, distribution of resources, euthanasia, all of these really life-affecting and life-ending practices are extremely difficult to adjudicate. So it's important for all of us, I think, to think through the complexities of this and to not not reduce them to simple kinds of formulas.
Well, so thank you so much once again, Professor Garland-Thomson, for your presence in this wonderful lecture and the discussion we had. It's clear that it raises all kinds of difficult questions, but yeah, we won't be able to solve them all today, I'm afraid. So thank you also to the audience for being here and coming up with all these interesting questions, and I'm sure the discussion will go on. Thank you.